every time you introduce something new, you introduce another thing that can be exploited by someone who, we might think of as a bad actor that wants to take advantage of that service in a way that you have no intention of them to do so.
That was Peter Pugh-Jones from a company called Confluent. Now, Confluent has built its reputation pioneering a fundamentally new category of data infrastructure that's focused on data in motion. And its cloud-native offering is the foundational platform for data in motion, which is designed to be intelligent, connective tissue that enables real-time data from multiple sources to constantly stream across an organisation. And their mission is simply to help every organisation harness data in motion so they can compete and thrive in the modern world. But today, I want to learn more about the quite concerning rise of fraud here in the UK and beyond. And I think it's as a result of the digital transformation of everything, with over £600 million, not dollars, stolen in the first half of 2022 last year alone. And the complexity of identifying and analysing the data that will identify fraud and duplication, fragmentation, etc. are very common as a result of siloing. And I know data silos is a huge topic that we cover so many times on here. And there's a good reason for that. It's a problem in every organisation around the world. And the particular risks of fraud in financial services organisations, where much of the data revolves around the finances of customers and the measures that businesses have taken to protect them, is such a big talking point. I really wanted to take a deep dive into it today and also learn more about the real-world strategies that businesses are already employing to better protect themselves and slow or eliminate fraud, including the establishment of the Fusion Centre, which is a combination of cybersecurity and fraud departments. I want to demystify that area a little bit today as well. But enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to be beaming your ears directly to Surrey here in the UK, where you can join me and Peter in conversation.
So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Neil. I'm Peter Pugh-Jones. I work at a company called Confluent. Confluent is a data streaming platform provider and was founded by the folks that created something called Kafka, or Apache Kafka, which many in the community will probably have heard of before.
Fantastic. Well, it's a huge pleasure to have you on the podcast today. And just to set the scene for our conversation, can you start by giving us a little context about the worrying rise of fraud in the UK, especially as a result of the digital transformation?
I'm lucky enough to work in a role that allows me to get involved and talk to lots of customers around the world of ours, predominantly in the financial services space. And actually, not just during digital transformation, I'd also argue that a part of it might be related to some of the challenges of COVID around the world over the last few years. But there was just a massive rise in fraudulent activity, for both reasons, in my opinion. I think organized crime became much better at doing digital fraud because they had to. And obviously, as people had to put more digital capabilities in place, it just became more and more of a real challenge for people around the world as a result of that.
And I'm curious, what is it that makes the identification and indeed the analysis of fraudulent data so complex? Can you elaborate on some of the challenge that has arisen due to data duplication and fragmentation?
The real challenge is that if you start looking at activity with somebody interacting with your services on the surface and without any real context of previous things, especially if you're looking at it live in some way to try and detect or predict something in the moment, it can be really difficult for you to see the difference between, a genuine interaction and something that wouldn't be genuine. And that makes it really hard for investigations team, who usually will receive some sort of alert from a live system that says, hey, there's something going on here that's not quite right, have a look at it. But those investigations teams, they often have a very limited time window to be able to decide if something looks as if it's a problem or not. Usually it's, it can be as short as 20 minutes. And if not, they have to just let the activity go through if they can't see anything. So one of the things we like to help customers do, and one of the things we've been focusing on, is thinking about, well, the stuff you already know how to do, the looking at data after the event, which is often the case. They'll look at things in batch mode sort of later on, maybe even a day or so later, and they'll say, oh, that we should have been able to detect that. Some of that analysis they do there, you could lift, and this is really the argument, you can lift that up and put it into the stream at the earliest stage of the data's inception. So really at the point where people are doing the interactions through their apps or through the phone calls or through the customer support lines, And if you can bring that information together as early as possible and start to build up a picture of context in those interactions as early as possible, you can do a lot more to protect the customers. We sometimes refer to them as entities, but the customers themselves, and you can protect your systems better because you can at least start to see earlier on, hey, there's some context here that's definitely different from the past, right? So suddenly Pete's just spent, 100 quid in Greg's. I don't know if that's possible or not, right? But 10 minutes ago, he was in Bloomingdale's in New York. That just can't be possible, right? And bringing that stuff together in the moment, is a much more powerful insight that you can gather. And that's really where we're bringing to get together the sort of concepts of the things that people traditionally do in separate lines. So you would traditionally have had in the past, a process of ETL. So you pick up some data from somewhere, you'll do some transformation on that data, you'll tidy it up, you'll put it somewhere else, then you'll analyze it later, and you'll start to detect patterns. But you can actually, in many cases, do all of that in flight as the data's actually in movement. And if you can do that continuously, you can derive temporal-based information as well, timeless information that would have been lost in other ways. So that's the sort of challenge that most customers bring to us to help solve.
And as someone that's right in the eye of the storm, so to speak, I suspect that you've seen so many different patterns around this in your career. So in your experience, are there any specific risks that are faced by financial services organisations with respect to fraud, given that there's so much data revolves around customer finances right now?
In a way, I feel quite sorry for folks who have to build systems, right? Because, I used to do that myself. I used to work at banks in the past, right? And so one of the things that has always struck me is, generally speaking, everything's well-intentioned, right? So you build a new service, a new capability, and you're doing it because you're trying to provide something better for your customers. Usually it's customer experience related. You want to make something more accessible. You want to make the customers feel, if it's retail-based scenario, you want them to feel more that you know them better, but not so much that they feel it's creepy, right?
Yeah.
And all of those things. But at the same time, every time you introduce something new, you introduce another thing that can be exploited by someone who, we might think of as a bad actor that wants to take advantage of that service in a way that you have no intention of them to do so. So it's a continuous struggle to combat those kinds of things. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's not specifically from banking, but I'm sure it's one you've heard before, which is, QR code fraud. I mean, it's one of the most common kinds of things that people are doing at the moment, especially with car parks in the UK. They'll go in, they'll print off their own QR codes, they'll stick them over the top of the QR code on the car park machine, and unsuspecting people are buying what they think is a parking ticket to park in the thing, and they're just paying someone through that looks exactly the same, the app looks exactly the same, and it's completely fraudulent. And these are the sorts of problems that, you introduce something to make life easier and you end up with someone exploiting it. And that's really the challenge. And then, of course, you've got in the banking industry, especially in the UK, you've got these new sort of rules, if you want to think of them as that, or new policies that will effectively mean that banks, although mostly have been very good at accepting that they will actually cover the costs of the fraudulent people being frauded or defrauded. But actually, in the future, that's going to be something they have to do, right? They won't have an option if they have to sort of stump up the cash for that themselves. So it becomes much more important from their perspective, because they won't be able to leave any kind of gap for someone else to be responsible for the loss, if that makes sense. They will have to pay for it themselves. And so they have to put better safeguards in place for their customers. It's all part of the new drive towards things like consumer duty rules and stuff like that as well.
And you mentioned there that you've got sympathy for those that are challenged with building those new systems today, as you've been in that position in the past. Once a techie, always a techie. I'm curious, do you miss anything from those days? Do you still like to roll up your sleeves and still show you've got it now and again?
Oh, absolutely. I love it, actually. I mean, one of the things I've always found is if you're very close to the technology, when you work in the tech business, it's actually a good idea to step back sometimes. And one of the reasons I love the job I have is that I get to sit in that space between the tech and the customer and sort of think about the kinds of challenges that they have and then how we might address them, but without getting so close to it. But then I love the ability to go and experiment, right? And I mean, especially at the moment, there's some really exciting new developments in the streaming space. I should have said earlier that a lot of my background has been in the event streaming space, which is actually a sort of fairly boutique capability that's been around for about 30 years, but just was not serviced by any great features until something like Kafka came along, which allowed us to have, okay, we've got a streaming platform. Now we can really start to do stuff with event stream processing and complex event processing that we really couldn't do very well before, because it was so specialized and so, hard linked. It was so complicated to do and very expensive. So often didn't succeed. So the modern era of technology, I think, really makes it much more fun to experiment with stuff like that. And you can in the type of tools we have today, you can very quickly experiment, figure out if something's going to work or not, without really having to invest a massive amount in the technology. In cloud services, for example, you can try it out. If it works, great. You can then think about putting that into production as an operational system.
And if there is anybody listening in the worlds of financial services, and are there any particular steps that you think that businesses should be taking to protect their customers from potential fraud attacks? Because, again, such a huge talking point, because as soon as that breach or that fraud attack happens, it can cause huge reputational damage that can last for years. Any steps that you think could be taken to avoid that?
Well, so one of the things that you can do is start to think about making systems or solutions you have in place less complex, because I think sometimes it's very easy to look at an architecture for something and have, right, this tool for this other tool for that, some other tool for something else, and then you think about architecting all those things together, and some of it's partially event-driven architecture, some of it's data at rest architectures, and you can do those things if you want, but by having those complex layers of software and very specialized tools in place can lead to overcomplication. And when you're trying to track something like what happened, how can I protect what happened from the moment the customer went into an app, did something, and how can I look back and see what went wrong so that maybe I can improve on that next time? It would be really good if you can simplify. So if you can add simplified capabilities in for governance and lineage and management in systems as the data's in flight, and then maybe even security aspects such as obscuring data in certain fields of information. We have a concept we talk about, and I'm sure it's been on your podcast many times before, data products, which is a way to create products and ownership of data products within a business that can then be made available to other parts of the business. So they're curated and managed by a team with the right sort of security and schemas and things in place. You can reduce the duplication of effort in a business. And in fact, that goes to the point I think you were asking me a little bit about, which was the idea of data centers that bring together different kinds of things, like a fusion center of some sort, which is where we bring together things like cyber and fraud, because there's many things that are in both that really can benefit each other, but are often looked at in silos. But if you bring that together into a simplified architecture where you've got lots of governance and lineage and schema management in the same place, then you can start to think about, well, what benefits can I get from merging those two things together, or those different sources from different silos together, including, risk management data as well, perhaps. So simplification is actually the thing. I think I always try to start by going, okay, if I could do anything at all, what would I do? And then I work back from that. And it may be that I end up with a fairly simple approach to start with, and then grow, just to deal with a particular problem, and then to help people grow and evolve that into their business or into their bigger vision for the future of the strategy they have for their business.
Love that. And you mentioned one of my favorite words there, simplify, because every day on this podcast, I attempt to demystify and simplify either emerging technologies or the latest buzzwords that people are talking about inside a business. So with that side of things, you did mention Fusion Center there. So can you explain the concept of Fusion Center and this combination of cybersecurity and fraud departments, and also how it's helping businesses in their counter-fraud strategies right now?
Yeah, so a Fusion Center is quite literally a way of describing, hey, there are things that people look for when they're doing cyber-based investigations, and there are things that people look for when they're doing fraud-based investigations that are very similar. And if you had access to both and could fuse them together in some way, it could in fact make you much more capable. So a really good example would be maybe on the cyber team, they're looking at things like IP addresses, frequency of login, whether there is the potential for someone to have taken over an account in some way. Whereas on the fraud side, they might be looking at individual transactions. Does this transaction look like it's Pete that's doing it? And, where was Pete when he did the last one? And so the information that's available to cyber is often really well established, and the information that's available to fraud is often really established. But in fact, sometimes they look at things slightly differently. And if you could bring them together into a fusion, or as I would think of more as a data product in a central streaming capability, you can then take advantage of both sides of those things. I mean, in the modern era, you've got access to things like behavioral characteristics, how people might be holding their phone. Are they holding it how they normally hold it? There's these tools like an open source project called Fingerprints. You've probably come across that one, which allows you to gather lots of really useful metrics from the local device itself that gives you some confidence level about it being an individual. And then you can do things like probability scores. We're moving into the analytics space there a little bit, but and even passing through analytics models to see whether the pattern is different from what you're expecting on the individual without necessarily knowing too much personal detail, right? Because you just need to know something historically. Pete generally does this kind of thing. What's different today and how different is it? And what's my level of concern that it's different? And by bringing those different centers together, you can make that a little bit better and a lot more predictive than it might already be. That's the way we tend to think of it.
And I'm curious again, with over 25 years of industry experience, I would imagine there's so much that has changed and so much that has stayed the same in equal measure. But how have you seen the landscape of cybersecurity and counter fraud evolve over the years, particularly in an era of digital transformation? I think most companies accept that it is a journey, not a destination now. But again, so many changes. So anything you've seen here, anything that stands out?
Well, so for me, it is about the services folks are offering and the way they can respond to it. And a lot of companies are getting a lot better at doing that. I mean, when I first started work, in all honesty, it's a little bit longer than 25 years. When I first started work, we were using sort of mostly VAX VMS machines, maybe some mainframes, and actually they're still very, very much used in the banking industry today. And, the capabilities we had in terms of hardware to be able to maintain and hold on to information really gave us limitations. So often you'd find that you'd adopt a relational database methodology simply because of the amount of data you had, and you just have to try and hold on to the things that were really important. And you would lose a lot of information as a result of that by creating these data models that were very static, very limited, and only let you focus on certain things. And in the modern era, we can actually look at everything. We don't have to keep it all, but we can certainly look at everything. And if we can look at everything, we can stick our head in the stream and analyze everything and count the red fish, but only after 3 green fish, but only after 1 blue fish kind of example, then you can really start to get some real insight from what's going on now. And I think it's all about that in the now, because most folks who might be listening to a podcast like this, I'm sure have mobile phones and watches that pop up with information on them all the time. That information is not just random, right? It's based on what those apps know you are interested in, and you generally get information alerts based upon it. In reality, that what we're trying to do in the banking space to gather insights for fraudulent activity and also for customer experience is no different, right? We're just trying to make it more accurate and treat you more like an individual, and hopefully safeguard you and the services at the same time.
And at Confluent, you're on a mission to better shape your capacity to better connect apps, data systems, and employees. But can you expand on these and how you ultimately help businesses to safeguard themselves against fraud, especially as we're entering the silly season, holiday season, where it becomes more important than ever?
Yeah, that's very true. I've always viewed things like fraud activity. I mean, we've kind of touched on it already. It's a bit like the story of the dam with the person trying to put the finger in the hole, right? When you put your finger in the hole to stop one thing and something else comes somewhere else, right? And so with fraud, it's always about continuously evaluating and evolving what capabilities you have to combat. And it's probably best to talk about it as being combating it rather than being able to stop it. I don't think it'll ever be something that can be stopped. But if you utilize the kinds of capabilities we're talking about, then that story I told you about an investigations team looking at something out of context and spending 20 minutes before they have to just allow it to happen, that becomes slightly better, because they might be able to look at something and say, well, actually, this is the current transaction I'm looking at. It's for this amount of money at Greg's. Does Pete ever spend 100 quid at Greg's? Right?
Yeah.
As an example. Actually, I have done before. But anyway, and if that's the case, what's the pattern of activity we see around him that we know about? It's really about that information and context. It's really about individual context knowledge without storing too much information. It's basically storing calculations and then comparing those calculations to the current activity. And I think that is the main thing that can help people out a lot. Now, if we go back, you asked me a question a moment ago about the beginnings of all of this. I mean, Most of this kind of analysis used to be done in early spreadsheet products, right? I mean, that's the truth of it. You'd be looking at transactions after the event, you'd be scanning things, you'd be slicing and dicing the data, and you'd try and find outliers, and those outliers would be, something a couple of days later that you'd identify. And the point being here is if you can identify it much sooner, you can maybe even stop it happening before even the first transaction goes through. And that's the nirvana, I think. And many companies strive to do that. It just depends on the amount of motivation they have and initiative to to think differently about how they work with their data.
And on behalf of everyone listening, a question I've got to follow up with is, how did you spend £100 at Greg's? Is it a sausage roll addiction, birthday cake? There's a story there, right?
There's definitely a story there. No, it was a kids' party. We were all out in the afternoon and everybody was starving. So we went to Greg's and cleared out everything they had.
I love it. And more serious matters, of course. Is there any advice you'd give to a business that maybe just starting their process of digital transformation in terms of implementing strategies to prevent fraud? Because they've probably got so many different questions. I'd be interested in your take on this and any particular standout pieces of advice you would offer.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, it's a very wide area, right? So there's lots of different types of fraud, and we haven't really touched on all the different ones. But generally speaking, the start point for anybody is to look at the biggest pain point they have. So really you need to, I would imagine it would be someone on the business side that's motivated to find a way to reduce the amount of money that they're losing to something, a particular kind of fraud that's taking place that they think they've identified as a problem. And maybe pick that project and say, okay, well, how are we working to solve that problem at the moment? What capabilities do we currently have to help us do that better? And then whether or not data streaming or event-driven architectures, if we don't use them currently, can help us change that in a way that is positive and has a better outcome for the business and the customer. And once they decide on that, they then have to think, and it is really important, there's no point in doing just a one-off siloed project. Do a one-off siloed project, of course, for that specific problem, but do it cognizant of the fact that if you're going to adopt it to help solve that one thing, you need to think about building it for your entire vision for your strategy, because the best way of implementing a data in motion kind of scenario or a data streaming platform is to adopt it as the backbone for all of these services, creating data products and eventually, data mesh kind of scenarios from it, which allows you to look at a way to evolve the entire business and how it works with data rather than just approaching it from a single siloed point. But start with that single point because it's the best way to prove the value of doing so.
And I know you are a techie at heart, and there is a real pressure on everyone to be in a state of continuous learning. So I've got to ask, where or how do you self-educate? How do you keep on top of these trends that seem to be evolving at a rapid rate?
Well, so, it is quite tricky keeping up with everything in the modern era, but luckily, I have access to a lot of books, so I do read quite a bit still. And certainly when it comes to things like AI, there's no end of conversation going on about that at the moment, right? So, and obviously my background is in that as well. So I tend to spend a lot of time reading books on that. I listen to podcasts like yours. I also spend quite a bit of time watching tech shows, my favorite tech shows. so I do all of those things. But the most important thing is to I'm always thinking about other things in other industries actually that might help the industry I'm in. And one of the things I've been very lucky having quite a varied career. So I've worked in mostly in financial services, but I've also worked a little bit in IoT and in other industries. And because of that, you can see how people have been successful deploying and implementing certain kinds of ways of doing things. And you can cross-pollinate that. You can bring that over and say, hey, wouldn't it be good if we could take what they did there in maybe the manufacturing space and maybe bring that into the banking space? And because they've been successful with it, why wouldn't we be as well? And those kinds of approaches, I think, help innovate quite a bit.
100% with you. I think it's a perfect moment to end on. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, interested in finding out more information about the things we mentioned today, about the report, about some of the best practices, maybe they want to contact your team or just find out more information about Confluent and how they might be able to help, where would you like to point everyone listening?
So I think the easiest place to start would be at our website. So that's confluent.io. And on that website, there's actually a financial services subsection where you can go and have a look at examples of what customers have been doing around the world. You can try out some examples you can download from Git, and you can also find a route to log into confluent.cloud. And once you're in there, you can even experiment and play around with some of these things, which, by the way, many of our customers do. So they might actually start their journey by playing with the free capability in the cloud and using that as a way to help them think about how to do things differently in the future. And it's been quite a successful approach for some of them.
Well, it's been a huge pleasure talking to you today. We covered so much in a short amount of time there, from the worrying rise of fraud in the UK, the particular risk of fraud in financial services organisations, and also some incredibly valuable takeaways from the strategies that businesses are employing to better protect themselves, slow or even eliminate fraud, including the establishment of the Fusion Centre, a combination of cybersecurity and fraud departments. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing that and how you spent £100 in grapes, of course. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Neil. It's been a pleasure.
As always, a huge thank you for taking the time to tune into another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. And we just had a fantastic conversation with Peter Pugh-Jones there from Confluent about a topic that couldn't be more timely or crucial: mitigating fraud risks in financial services. From reputational damage to operational inefficiencies, the consequences of not addressing these issues are manifold. And I think today we delved into the multifaceted approaches for combating these challenges. And a big thank you to Peter for highlighting the need to streamline data architectures and implement event-driven systems, and also making a strong case for fusion centres as a means for harnessing data to gain actionable insights. And these are not just solutions for large banks, it's for businesses of all sizes. They all stand to benefit from adopting such systems for early detection and management of fraud risks. And I think in our fast-evolving technological landscape, staying ahead of the curve is no longer just a competitive advantage. It's a necessity. And Peter reminded us that continual self-education, be it through books, podcasts, or learning from parallel industries, is also essential. And it's also clear that while technology poses challenges, it also provides us unprecedented opportunities. And the very data that makes us vulnerable can be harnessed to shield us from threats. So understanding customer needs better and innovating for a safer, more efficient future, that's the exciting bit for me. But obviously, you've heard from today's guest. What did you think of today's conversation? The key takeaway for me was that a well thought out, data-driven strategy can tilt the scales towards eliminating fraud. But what about you? What experiences have you had? As always, you know the drill. Email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just at Neil C. Hughes if you want to send me a DM. And if you want to work with me or check out 2,500 interviews, go to techblogwriter.co.uk. But that's it for today, so I'm going to sign off. I'll meet you here, same time, same place tomorrow. And thank you for listening as always. But until next time, don't be a stranger.